knows,
Sorry.
real estate, cemeteries. He is sort of our go-to fellow who can really help churches think deeply about financial capacity for the sake of mission and ministry, as well as help churches think about what tomorrow could look like in terms of reinventing or reimagining yourself. And he has just a whole sack full of stories he can share. But really glad to have Paul with us. He comes from the corporate world and actually working in hospital administration, but has been with the foundation. How many years now, Paul? Are you at, you're muted, 15, 18 years?
18 years.
Wow.
18 years on staff, 7 years as a volunteer.
So glad to have Paul with us today. And this is our third forum of SALT, Seasoning for Small Churches. And I'm really going to go ahead and just hand it over to Paul. But in the meantime, just before I do that, I do want to let you know, I am so honored to serve as your ministry relations officer, but I'm also excited that we'll be hiring or adding a 10th ministry relations officer to our team. On July 5th will be Rose Eileen Niles, a well-known minister from the Synod of the Northeast. Originally, she's going to be moving back to the Northeast to cover the Synod of the Northeast, as well as presbyteries of Donegal and Philadelphia. And then I will cover the remainder of Pennsylvania and pick up 4 other presbyteries just south of me. So my territory is going to shift, so I will not be your ministry relations officer after July 5th, but I'll be journeying alongside Rose and being of support to her as she picks up these relationships. And it's really been an honor to serve you folks these last 7.5 years. And I'm still in this game with you, and we'll be journeying alongside Rose. If you have questions or things you want to start working on even before then, still give me a ring. We can begin the conversation, and then I can hand the relationship over to Rose. But it is good to be with you. So without further ado, Paul Greer.
All right, thank you, Ellie. And it's a pleasure to be with you. I have spent more than just a little bit of time in your area. About 6 years ago, we worked with a number of congregations in Syracuse, and I got pretty good at making the drive from Syracuse over to Albany, where we continue to work with some of the same churches, as a matter of fact. So Ellie has shared with me some of the work that you folks have done together, and she has shared the financial health assessments that were provided in forum number 2. And gosh, that's really helpful background to have. There are a couple of things that I hope we can do together, and then we will have, I don't know if we're going to do breakout or just open discussion. We'll figure that out. 2 things that I'd like to cover with you are, number 1, what is the norm in terms of the life cycle of congregations? And then number 2, a very brief series of 3 vignettes, 2 that went really, really well. And 1, well, there's a reason why I'm going to tell you the names of the 2 that went well, but the guilty shall remain anonymous. And we'll get to that in a few moments. So church life cycles, and as I begin, I need to pay tribute to our friends at the Disciples of Christ. That denomination is based in Indianapolis, and their New Beginnings program is a marvelous, marvelous exercise. For a period of time, the Presbyterian Mission Agency also offered New Beginnings under license from the Disciples of Christ, and with their permission, we will use their thinking of church development, congregational development, and that life cycle. As I look at the faces on the screen, we are different ages. And Ellie's a lot younger than me, and she reminds me of that on a frequent basis. But as Ellie has moved from newlywed to newly married to mom to now having a daughter who is, what grade? What grade Zibby going to be in?
Getting into second grade.
Second
But
grade.
I'm a middle-aged mom, so I'm still considered elderly in terms of maternal fetal medicine.
So even as Ellie moves into different seasons of life, my wife and I are empty nesters as of 2 years ago. It's still pretty expensive, but at any rate, whether it's with children and marital harmony, or whether it's in congregational life, there are some predictable markers along the way. And so we begin with a kind of basic one, birth, the starting of a church. And in some of your churches, that was probably in the 1800s, maybe even in the 1700s. Maybe you've got some that were birthed within the last 5 or 10 years. Many Protestant congregations were birthed in the 1950s and early 1960s. And we still think of those as new churches, but in fact, most of those churches are 60 plus years old. And some of them still operate today the way they operated in 1958, because, we Presbyterians aren't real good about doing change. Next slide, please. And so churches have different elements. They grow, they plateau, and then in their older age, their health declines. And you'll see on the screen the energy that is so exciting in a new church development, and then the necessity of infrastructure, administration, programming. And then you hit that plateau, and sometimes that plateau lasts for 2 years, and sometimes it lasts for 200 years. And then, when nobody's watching, the compression begins, and we often don't really notice it until we're already 5 years into that decline, that season of decline. And again, the decline might be quick, or it might be over the course of 2 generations. A loss of energy, a loss of vision, losses of relationships with ministry partners, with one another, with, frankly, sometimes the presbytery. And then you begin to see program losses. And then difficult decisions have to be made. Can we afford to stay in this building? Can we afford a full-time pastor? Well, what if we took our pastor to 3/4 time? Or what if we cut out Vacation Bible School? Gosh, we could save $750 that way. Next slide, please. There's also a different way of looking at growth and decline. Next slide. There's the growth and decline with an overlay of sustainability. So let's talk about sustainability. Now, Ellie told you I didn't go to seminary, and the MBA curriculum didn't have much theology in it. And so I'm going to talk to you from a business perspective. And sustainable and not sustainable. See, if we were in person, I'd go around the room, and the people that were breaking eye contact, I would call on them, and I'd make Neil speak up, and I'd make Susan Marks speak up. Those are the 2 names that I see first. But don't worry, I'm not going to do that, because it's just different on Zoom. It's not near as much fun picking on Neil when you're doing it electronically. But sustainable and not sustainable are terms that we get lots of very creative definitions of. But in fact, all it means, did you end the year with a surplus, or did you end the year with a deficit? Plain and simple. What did the numbers say? Did you break even? Did you have a surplus? Or did you incur a loss? And you'll see that in the life cycle of churches, the surpluses only come in that sustainable, obviously that's self-defining, in that sustainable section of quadrants 2 and 3. Because in quadrant number 1, you're in startup mode. Presbytery's probably providing funding. Generous members who are excited about this new and growing church community, they're providing funding. Because you know that, just like in business, once you achieve a certain critical mass, You know that the money's going to take care of itself. The more difficult one is quadrant number 4, where you've got an expense structure. That church that started in 1958 with that great big building with the center aisle and the flat floor and the tall, I mean, you know, Ellie and I, we know about church architecture. We can tell you when a church building was built. That building doesn't get any smaller, even if the congregation compresses from 1,000 members to 500 to 200 to 80 to 40 to 13. And so many times the fixed costs, the overhead costs, are such that our friends in quadrant number 4 just don't have the critical mass. They don't have the funding that is required for the infrastructure of that campus, that programming, and that clergy. Next slide. So how many churches are in which? Now this is a non-denominational, no, I said that wrong. This is a multi-denominational perspective of mainline churches. And the research shows, you know, we mainliners aren't starting a whole lot of churches these days. So there are not a whole lot that are in that number 1 startup mode. And they're a relatively small percentage in number 2. Most of our churches, 80% of our churches, are in 3 or 4. They aren't growing anymore by membership. And 35% of them are in that area of being non-sustainable, of drawing down reserves, of taking an unhealthy percentage of their endowment each year. I'm working on one right now where they're taking a 10% draw on their endowment. Well, you can do that for maybe 1 or 2 years, but long term, they're going to be spending down the reserves and the endowment that took generations to build. And then almost half of our churches in the mainline church are in that number 3. Number 3 is a pretty happy place. Maybe not quite as big as we were 10 years ago or 50 years ago, but we're still doing quite well, thank you. And we're learning to do with fewer volunteers. Maybe we've even compressed the size of the session. I'm working with another church, used to have 2,000 members, and now they have fewer than 200, but they still have 28 elders. You know, it's probably time to rethink that session schedule there. So if we were together in person, we would ask for a show of hands of where you think you are. And what we usually see in these forums, that a half to 2/3 of folks see themselves in quadrant number 4. And quadrant number 4 can be a place of great joy and great fulfillment, but it can also be a place of loneliness. It can be a place of guilt, and it can surely be a place of fear. Last slide, please. So what are some of those characteristics in the 4th quadrant? The decline can be quick or it can be slow, almost unnoticeable. There are usually financial struggles. And frankly, when the foundation gets a phone call, it's usually about finances. Sometimes there is a sense of despair. Sometimes there's even a sense of hopelessness. You know, one word that doesn't appear on this, and Ellie and I have done this dozens, if not hundreds of times, and I don't know why we haven't added this word, but a sense of fatigue, a sense of noticeable fatigue, because the same group of volunteers and the same group of staff are doing everything, and there are fewer of them. And whether it's financial struggles or nervousness about change, I mean, for Pete's sake, this is how you know it wasn't written by Presbyterians, because we're nervous about any kind of change. And I say that as an 8th generation Presbyterian. I don't mind change as long as it affects only Ellie and not me. That's the way Presbyterians are. And particularly since the average Presbyterian is 65 years old, We've been around the block a few times. We've pretty well decided what we like and what we don't like. And when we find a church that we like, God help the person that comes in and wants to make changes to the way we're doing things. Sometimes this fourth quadrant is reflected in a certain level of tentativeness about outward activities, about outward mission. Sometimes these churches find themselves inwardly focused. I worked with a church in Pennsylvania that began locking the front door. Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, they locked the front door. I won't tell you the whole story, but it's a pretty cool story. A guy that lived 3 doors down thought the church had closed. He walked his dog at 11 o'clock because he's Roman Catholic and they get to go to Mass whenever they want to. And he told me about the church that had closed. I had been there the week before. That church was not closed. But in the eyes of the neighbor, it was closed because the door was locked, the parking lot was empty, and the front porch lights were not on. And when I called the pastor, and you know what the pastor said, well, everybody parks in the back. Well, but why is the front door locked? Oh, because everybody knows to come in the back door. And when I said, I know this Roman Catholic guy, he lives 3 doors down, 4 doors down, and he thinks the church is closed. And so help me, the pastor, without a hint of irony, says, well, do we really care what the Catholics think? That would be an extraordinary version of being inwardly focused. And I do love that story. And yes, it is a true story. It did not happen in New York State, but it happened in a contiguous state.
In my territory.
It's Ellie's territory. It's Ellie's fault. When we begin looking more and more inward, a sense of vulnerability, a sense of fear becomes very, very real. Now you'll notice the bottom right shows a blue arrow. And the blue arrow might mean, the very tip of that arrow might be pointing to dissolution. It might be pointing to the end of the church's visible ministry, or it might be pointing to that moment in which the tide is turned and another upward trend begins. As one of our participants called it once, he said, I want our congregation to be the 2-hump camel. And so what happens down there at that bottom right is up to you. And so what we'll spend a little bit of time on now is 3 quick vignettes. These are real life stories. I have had personal involvement with each of these. I have been on site at each of these. Ellie has been on site in 2 of the 3, and that's all I'm going to tell you about the guilty one. And so let's talk for a moment about these real life vignettes, real life Presbyterians just like us, who came to the conclusion that a change had to be made. Now, as we talk about these, I'd like you to think about 5 attributes. You might want to jot this down. The 5 attributes are that every reinvention takes these 5 things. You cannot do it without these 5 things. You can't do it with 4, you can't do it with 3. It takes 5 and always 5. Number 1 is money. It takes money to reinvent a church. It takes money that you're not yet spending. Don't think you're just going to reallocate what you spent on X and commit it to Y. It takes new money to do a reinvention. Number 1 is money. Number 2 is energy. Whether you want to call it sweat equity or whether you want to just resign yourself to the fact that you're going to be at session meetings every Sunday night for the next year and a half, it takes energy. money, energy. Number 3 is time. Now, we Presbyterians don't move fast on a good day, but reinvention takes time. And if you're going to do anything other than change the color of the carpets, and by the way, we had a church, that was their reinvention plan. They were going to change the color of the carpets. If you're going to do anything else, plan on a good 3 years to be able to see results. This is long-term work we're talking about. Number 1, money. Number 2, energy. Number 3, time. Number 4 is leadership. Staff leadership, volunteer leadership. If we're working with a church and they're thinking about a major reinvention, and I'm looking at that pastor and he looks like he's 112 years old, I'm going to go ahead and ask him his retirement plans, because you can't start this and then bail. Number 4 is leadership, both volunteer and clergy. Number 5 is vision. What is it that God's calling you to be? In this time, in this place, what is God calling you to be as a worshiping community? Got to have all 5. Thank you, Karen. Number 1 is money. Number 2 is energy. Number 3 is time. Number 4 is leadership. And number 5 is vision. Don't try to do it with 3 of the 5 or 2 of the 5. And for Pete's sake, don't try to do it with 0 of the 5. There is no online website that you can go to and order up a church reinvention that's free. So these 5 things, I encourage you to think about those as we walk through these vignettes. Number 1 might be one you're familiar with, Genesee Valley Presbytery, South Presbyterian Church. Karen's nodding her head. Some of you might know Deb Fay Swift. She is a force of nature if there ever was one. And so after 170 perfectly good years of traditional ministry in Rochester, the pastor, Deb Swift, the associate pastor, the elders looked around and they discovered that Rochester had changed and continues to change. And they sold their property. 7 years ago, they sold their property. They bought t-shirts. This is true. They bought t-shirts to wear for the closing worship. And the t-shirts said, "The church has left the building." And that has been a recurring theme. Since then, there have been 2 mergers, and they embarked upon a 7-year experiment, and we're in right at the end of year 6. They're moving into year 7. They still don't know if this is going to work. There have been 2 mergers since then, and that provided some nice capital infusions with the sale of other properties. 7-year experiment, working towards sustainability. Now, in 2019, they had a $120,000 operating deficit. 2020 was looking really great until COVID-19 came along, and it's still too early to really tell what all the effects will be. But you're probably wondering, well, so who were they and what did they do? Well, they had 8 elders, they had 8 deacons, they had a total of 53 members, and they had 1.5 staff. And they had this bold and audacious idea that they were going to try a non-place-based ministry. Let me say that again. A non-place-based ministry. So what do we say on Sunday mornings at 10:45 as we're getting into our car? We say we're going to church. Well, they don't say that at South Presbyterian Church. They have 16 programs that they call acts of faith. And worship is one of those acts of faith. But they don't go to the church. They go to the retirement community. All right, now y'all, I live in South Carolina. Y'all live where it gets cold. And it gets cold in Rochester. And what they discovered was people in a retirement community don't mind going to a church when they don't have to walk outside. Now, see, in the South, that would only help, we'd only care about that in June, July, and August. But where you live, the weather is a deterrent to some folks, particularly older folks or people who don't drive. It's a deterrent to attending worship. And so South Presbyterian Church took worship to the retirement community. They have other acts of faith, Bible and brew, a Bible study at a local pub, dinner and a movie, international dinners, the Mount Hope World Singers. My favorite is the Slow Sheep. It's the mall walking group, and they do walking and medication. No. Oops, it's not medication, it's mediation. I'm sorry. Yeah, well, that's what you get when you run by Walgreens first thing in the morning to pick up your prescription, and I did. They have the New Life food cupboard. They have the South Heart Fellowship. I'm going to tell you just for a moment about South Heart. Deb Faye Swift is a conniving, manipulative woman. Don't ever get in the car with her, because if you get in the car with her, you're going to end up someplace that you are not comfortable. And she said, oh, come on. I go there usually twice a year, check in on them. Oh, come on, you'll enjoy this. Where are we going? Well, we're going for a drive. Do not believe her when she says that. She is lying. She has an ulterior motive. And so we went to a forensic psychiatric facility. I want you to think about that. I didn't know what a forensic psychiatric facility was, but I had to get processed and I had to leave all my stuff in a locker. And we went in and we had worship with a bunch of the church's volunteers. And friends, I was so far outside my comfort zone until during the passing of the peace, a gentleman approached me and shook my hand and said, "You're new here." Yes. He said, "Deb is my pastor. This is my church." I told Deb about that later. And she told me that gentleman would probably never live anywhere other than an inpatient forensic psychiatric facility. But that was and is his church. It's bold to take the church to the retirement community. It is absolutely courageous to take the church to the forensic psychiatric facility. And that's what South Presbyterian Church has done. Now, it's kind of hard to keep score when you don't have pews and you don't have Sunday worship attendance the way we all used to do it before COVID. And so what they do is every quarter they evaluate each of those 16 programs for what they call energy and excitement. And if the energy is flagging, if the excitement is not present, they have said right up front, we will kill off a program if it's no longer meeting needs. In other words, they don't believe in sacred cows. They just check to see if the beef is still fresh. And they have killed off some of their programs and they have started new programs. They measure contacts. In 2019, they had 13,000 contacts with 1,700 individuals. We would call that a pretty big church. And they don't even have their own building. They rent office space in a kind of nondescript office park. And they take the church to the people. They also believe in financial transparency when the news is good and when the news is troubling. They have mission partnerships throughout Rochester with traditional congregations and with non-traditional congregations and other parachurch ministries. They've made enormous progress. They have increased their membership, their engagement. They've had shrinking deficits. and they will tell you very quickly, still, it might not work. And Deb and I have had some pretty serious conversations about, how do you know? Well, you look for energy, you look for excitement. That's that second E. And you're willing to make changes when changes are necessary. And I asked her once, Deb, how are you going to feel if this doesn't work? And she said, we will have been faithful to the gospel until the very end. We dream big dreams. We did bold and audacious things, and we hope they will work. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But they are confident that they have done the right things. It took money, it took energy, it took time, it took leadership, it took vision, and it still does today. Vignette number 2, Whitfield Estates Presbyterian Church, Sarasota, Florida. Some of you will remember Robert Schuller in the Crystal Cathedral. Robert Schuller himself told me that one of the inspirations for what became the Crystal Cathedral was Whitfield Estates Presbyterian Church. I sat next to him on a flight back from somewhere. Gosh, he looked old in person. He looked pretty good on television. He looked old in person. And he just loved the Presbyterians. And so Robert Schuller started this drive-in church. Well, friends, Whitfield Estate was doing drive-in church in 1952. Those of you that are familiar with Southwest Florida, you got Tampa, you've got Fort Myers, and you got Highway 41 that goes down near north to south over there near the Gulf Coast. And that's where Whitfield Estates Presbyterian Church was, north of Sarasota, south of Bradenton, Tamiami Drive, it's called. It claims to have been the first drive-in church, and nobody's contradicted that yet, so maybe they were. It was a 2-story building, lots of beautiful stained glass. The chancel was arranged with the pews facing the chancel, kind of, sort of. But this whole wall over here was glass so that some people could sit inside, but all these people would drive up into this huge grassy backyard, and they could see the minister. And through the wonders of technology at that era, and some of us remember going to the drive-in, Ellie, I'll tell you about it sometime. You go to the drive-in theater, and there's this post, and there's this thing that's about yay big, and you lift it off, and it's got a wire that's always frayed, and you put your window down, and you put the, see, Karen remembers this. You put this speaker on the side of your car with the window down, and that's how you watch the drive-in movies. And somebody figured out that you could also listen to a sermon that way. And so some of the pews faced, so the pulpit's in the middle, and the pulpit actually faces the glass. So I guess you were looking at the preacher in profile if you were actually sitting in the worship space. 60 years go by. And they still have a few people driving in. And you've probably already figured out that if you're going to see the preacher from your car, then she has to be elevated. And she was on the 2nd floor. And that church didn't have an elevator. And as the number of in-person worshipers outnumbered the drive-in worshipers, somebody, you know what's coming, somebody said, you know what? Our average member is 80 years old. We don't have an elevator. Let's move this down to the fellowship hall, which is on the 1st floor. And that's exactly what they did. They didn't have children in the church. There was a lot of deferred maintenance. Worship was down to about 25 people. Fast forward, and this was a 5-year process. They sold their property to the marina across the street. They moved 2 miles up the road from a Sarasota address to a Bradenton address. They bought an old dentist's office and renovated it, 1 story, lots of parking, no steps. They renovated it, and they've got a small worship space, a couple of offices, a meeting room, and a little kitchenette. Oh, and by the way, they moved right across the street from a Presbyterian Homes facility so that the folks at Presbyterian Homes could walk across the street to church. They changed their name. One of the trends out there now is not to have a denominational affiliation. So they changed their name to Oak Point Presbyterian Church. They shifted their mindset, that vision thing. They decided they were going to quit obsessing about the fact that they didn't have children, and they were going to focus on retirees. What a novel idea in South Florida. Because what Ellie's colleague Robert Hay and I told them over and over was, quit worrying about the fact that you don't have little kids. You're one of the few parts of the country that has a continuing new supply of senior adults. And Presbyterians do senior adults pretty well. So they moved up the road, they right-sized their location, and they began having church. They let the community use their conference room and even their worship space. And from 2012 to 2018, their membership doubled and their worship attendance quadrupled. They went from 25 people to 100 people. And you know what people say? What people say is they love having 100 people there because they can hear one another sing. Because previously, whether it was in the fellowship hall or whether it was in the sanctuary with all that glass, there were too few people and too much space. And so, of course, this was all a simple, easy process, and everyone was happy, right? No, of course not. They lost some members. Some members left quietly because they just didn't like the direction. And then the true Presbyterians that left, they left loudly, and they made sure everybody knew what they thought about it. There were letters that would fly back and forth about this isn't going to work and that isn't going to work. The one thing they didn't hear was nobody said, well, we tried that once before, because nobody had tried something like this. And what you have today is you have some of the old timers still. You got a bunch of new people that enjoy a worshiping community that is alive, that is vibrant, that has a vision, that is outward facing. And it took money, and you probably figured out in both of these cases, the money came from the sale of a church property. It took energy, it took time, years. It took leadership. It took vision. And the two women who led those two churches through that season of change could not have been more different. But they had that enthusiasm, they had that excitement. It was expressed in different ways. Jane Joan Norris, who has since retired from the Oak Point Church, quiet, subdued. Any of you know that Deb Swift would never be described as quiet or subdued. But they both had this level of just unbeatable energy. They created an atmosphere of excitement so that people were ready to do something bold. And then finally, here's one that didn't work so well. It was in the Northeast. They sold their property at about the same time that South Presbyterian in Rochester sold theirs. So check off that number one. There was money available. We worked with them. One of Ellie's colleagues and I worked with them quite a lot. There was a lot of financial ambiguity. Their financial statements were absolutely impossible to discern. I've been the chief financial officer of a couple of healthcare companies, and I couldn't make heads nor tails of their financial statements. The session didn't meet terribly often or terribly regularly, and when they did meet, they often didn't have financial statements at their disposal. And we got the feeling that nobody really had their arms around the totality of the ministry enterprise from a financial standpoint. Well, they sold their building and then they had a bunch more money. But it was never really clear as to where that money was going to go and what it was going to be used for. Their ministry model was to nest with another congregation, and that's growing in popularity. Oh, I forgot to mention, in their old church building, they had a gymnasium. It was a commercial gymnasium that was run by a church member. They paid rent. Everybody thought that was a great deal. And I think members got a discount or something like that. Well, so when they sold their building, I just kind of assumed that the exercise ministry, if you will, would go by the wayside. Oh, no. No, they nested with a congregation and then they went out and rented commercial space for that gymnasium. Well, I got to tell you, the guy that ran it, he was a bundle of energy. He embodied excitement. He was in his late 40s. The guy was ripped, but I guess if you're going to own a gym, you probably would be. And most of the time, Ellie's colleague and I met with the pastor and that guy. It's kind of funny. We didn't meet with the entire session ever. It was 2, sometimes 3 people, but usually those 2 key leaders. And then sadly, the exercise guy dropped dead, young, tragic, confirming my long-held theory that exercise will in fact kill you. And there was nobody to run the gym. There was nobody that understood the gym. Nobody really knew who owned the equipment and how the revenue model worked. And very, very quickly, dramatically even, within 9 months of that gentleman's death. So before his estate was even settled, the church was on life support. And it did not survive. Well, let's think. They had the money. They had one elder that had an enormous amount of energy and excitement, but if I'm being truthful, the pastor was long since ready to retire. The pastor had been living in the old church. It's an expensive market, and they had sort of built an apartment in the old church. And apparently nobody thought through the fact that when they sold the building, the pastor needed someplace to live. And the pastor was kind of bitter about that. So they had money, they had some energy. Did they have enough time for that to work? No, not really, because of an unexpected death. Did they have vision? Oh gosh, not beyond the gymnasium. And did they have leadership? Well, they had one really strong leader. And they had a pastor who was a great guy. I liked the guy. He would be characterized as a very good follower, but not an especially inspiring leader. And the presbytery tried to help, but there is the old saying, too little and too late. Well, there are a couple of other things to think about. We asked some questions about the community they were leaving and the community that they were going to in this nesting model. Nobody seemed to know anything about the community. Nobody in the church lived near the church building, either old or new. It was sort of a place that people went to and came from. And it's probably kind of hard to establish a presence if you don't know your neighbors. And because they hadn't known their neighbors in the property they owned, they didn't see any importance in getting to know the neighbors of the property that they were borrowing. There wasn't a good accountability system there. There wasn't good financial reporting, because I think that's important. I don't know that they had any congregational meetings the last couple of years they existed. They had a strong leader, but that strong leader was singularly focused on the exercise ministry. And then in the absence of that strong leader, things literally fell apart. Two great inspiring stories and one very sad story from both a personal standpoint and an organizational standpoint. So Ellie will lead us in a discussion of, in what of these vignettes do you see any hints of your own situation, of the opportunities that face you? How can you learn from those who have succeeded, and how can you avoid the problems that were encountered by that third group? So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ellie.
Excellent. And I'm going to ask Karen to break us out into small groups. We'll put about 4 people per group. We have 20 total, but 3 of them are Craig, Paul, and myself. If we end up in a room, we'll just be listeners. But let's break out into groups let's take 8 minutes.
Okay.
And talk with one another again. What were the contributing factors you heard in those 3 vignettes? For the 2 in terms of successes, and that last one in terms of disappointment. Again, how can you think about it within your own context? What kind of questions does it stir in you? What thoughts arise out of this? Let's go ahead and head to our rooms.
Okay.
Hey there, everybody. As you come back, please remember to mute yourselves so I don't have to be the bad person who does it for you. Look at you all.
But I'm also going to invite you to share from your group. What did you hear? And so remember to unmute yourself. If you want to wave and then I can call on you. What did you hear in terms of successes and disappointments, and how that gets you thinking about your own context and what that means for ministry moving forward? Yes, Neil, would you unmute yourself, please?
One of the things we talked about was different uses for a church building, and opening it to a community, like on a Saturday when people are walking by, so they can use the bathroom, they can sit in the sanctuary and meditate. And, sometimes just the building itself can be an aid to worship.
Excellent. Others? Jim Renfrew.
Yeah, I'm sort of dealing with a conundrum here. In 2 of the 3 vignettes, Paul, a very key ingredient was the dynamic leader, the person with the vision and the energy. And wow, we can all benefit from that. But I always worry about the sustainability. If that's the sole person who has the energy and the vision, and then they should die, like the case you gave, or retire or move on. So on the one hand, I want that energetic person to be at the center of things, but then it feels like it's unsustainable to expect that somebody will just step into their shoes and carry on in the same way.
I think that's a fair point. Our friends in the non-denominational space will tell you that we mainliners might have unrealistic expectations of how long a church, an individual congregation would last. They will tell you that on the outside, they hope for 40 years, whereas we think of 40 years as being a new church development. So I guess that works out to 2, 3 strong leaders in a row And your point, Jim, is a very good one. That strong leadership is absolutely essential. And what do you do when Jane Jones Norris retires or when Deb Faye Swift retires? It's a great question.
If I could pop in, Paul, sometimes it's also not the pastor who becomes that central person. It can also be an elder or someone else in the congregation who has the vision. And it's the same challenge, right? Because it's a lot of energy getting something like that launched, and how long they can sustain that energy as well beyond the launch can be a real challenge.
So if I could just follow up with a comment that it seems like the best leadership would be the kind that's generating new leadership and not doing the mistake that I started out with in my first church where I did everything. And then when I left, the church died. That was not a good model.
Precisely. Others, comments or your thoughts from your small group?
Hi, Karen.
Yes, David.
How are you doing? Say, Jim and I had an interchange where I said that the most expendable person in the congregation was the pastor, because pastors come and go. And I'm not being disrespectful to the pastor, but the congregation is going to be there and they're going to have their hissy fits and they're going to fight for years. So in the case of my church, it's people within the congregation, and they change from time to time, but who provide the point to lead. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. But if you do not have leadership coming out of the congregation, you're between a rock and a hard place.
And we know in the life of a church, sometimes those actuarial tables, it's hard to say, but we look at those we're losing, and we have so many gifted elders and members who die, and we mourn that greatly. And sometimes that actuarial table is to the benefit of the church, where someone joins the church triumphant, and all of a sudden the congregation is able to listen for the Spirit of God and not that person who may have been bullheaded and put a stop to everything, right? So we know that exists in our congregations as well from time to time, right? Is that fair to say? Yeah. Others, what did you take? What did you see as marks of the successes and marks of disappointment? Yes, Susan, March. You're muted. There you go.
There we go. I'm in Marcellus. I'm the treasurer of First Presbyterian Marcellus. We, we're addressing, our stewardship committee and the finance committee is addressing, perceived not so far long-term, negative financial issues, plus the part where everybody's passing away and our attrition and whatever. And we're dealing with people who just kind of say, well, it'll all work out. We have faith. And that's very, I'm glad people have faith, but it's very hard for us to fight it. And our session needs, we're at a point now where we're pushing session hard to really look at this. But to do something like selling the building, our building is huge, something like selling the building, we have a good functioning daycare that rents from us in our building. Plus we have the town food pantry. So we do have other people relying on this building too. So that's an issue also. So, we're starting to explore looking for directions to go. It's totally new to me, and I don't know what to do.
Paul, do you have any, you have a lot of stories, as I said, of churches that have navigated the future in different ways. And there are some who have stayed in their building, but they have figured out how to do so. Some it's by nesting with others and sharing space and reducing costs. Others, it may be, is there a community organization that would want to receive that building, but continue to provide space for that congregation? Do you have other models and things to think about?
Mhm. Yeah, I've got to say our building is very old also. So that's eating a lot of resources, a lot of money and hours and work. And, that's an issue in itself.
And in some of your communities, I'm guessing property sells for a reasonable price, and others it would go for a little bit of nothing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it might be better to have a controlled burn.
Yeah.
So you don't have a building eating away at your resources and figuring out new space for ministry, right?
Yeah.
Susan, I would respectfully suggest this. We hear this a lot. Oh, well, we've got a food pantry, we've got a preschool, et cetera, et cetera. If those organizations are making the church sustainable, then you would view those partnerships in one way. If, on the other hand, even with the presence of those organizations, if the church is still not sustainable, then they might be partners, or they might be the brother-in-law that started sleeping on the sofa and just won't move out. And the trouble with that brother-in-law is, he starts out by cooking dinner for everybody, and then after a while, it's just doing the dishes. And before you know it, he's drinking the good beer, and he's not contributing in any way. Now, and I'm not casting dispersions on your tenants. Don't misunderstand me. But here's the thing we often say. If you can't support the building, even with tenants, then go to the tenants and ask them if they're interested in buying the building, and basically just do a flip. They go from being the tenant to the landlord, and you go from being the landlord to the tenant. I have never known a situation where the tenant has said, oh yes, we would be happy to be responsible for this.
Yeah.
And we chuckle about that, but the reality is that most of our churches aren't covering their costs even with tenants.
Right.
And I had a preschool director tell me once, it was a separately incorporated preschool, and I was touring, the church was going to sell the building, and she said, I just don't know what I'm going to do, because nobody else in town would ever think about renting me this space as inexpensively as First Presbyterian Church. So one of the things we always say is take a look at the financial structures you have in place with your partners, and see if there are some possibilities there.
And if you do have unused space, are there other nonprofits that you could rent to? What would the requirements be? Would you have to bring your building up to code to be able to lease to those other nonprofits? Of course, you want to be in conversation with your Presbyterian trustees, because you don't enter into any long-term leases without their approval. But you really want to think about that. You also want to think about if you're renting to anyone, leasing to anyone who's not a not-for-profit, a nonprofit. We have churches in New York City who part of their building is rented out to Starbucks, but that means part of that building is then taxable, right? It's on the tax rolls. And so you really want to be discerning on those kind of pieces. But I also know a pastor in Lake Erie Presbytery, Paul, Emily Zeig Lindsay. She's in her second of 2 calls, and in both situations had worked with the local YMCA, and their church had not had a great deal of their building unused. And with one church, it was an after-school program, another, it was a daycare. COVID has slowed things down with her second church in terms of the Y coming in and providing daycare in their space, but they will be running it at a fair market value. It's good for the Y, it's good for them. They do have to come up to standard in terms of having an elevator, but what's interesting is the Y will fund the building of that elevator. But the church is expected to repave their parking lot. So there are other costs that go into that. And again, it's been put on hold because of COVID. But, you know, there are churches who are being creative to figure out, you know, with all of our space that goes unused, how might it be used for the sake of the community, but in such a way that it helps cover our property costs. Our occupation costs, or not occupation, occupancy costs, excuse me.
Yeah, no, and we've done an analysis of the cost of our occupants and the rent that they're paying, and you know, the whole thing. And yes, we're on the positive side, and we also see it as a mission, because Marcellus is a very small town, very rural, and I'm, you know, okay, so we quote make a little money on it, but that's still, you know, our other expenses, not just building expenses, our other expenses aren't carrying, you know, our income doesn't carry the other expenses.
Absolutely. Paul?
You know, I think when we talk about the building, to me, we're dodging the big issue because these are Band-Aids. Sooner or later, you rent out your space and you balance the budget today. But it seems to me, unless we grow member-wise or merge or something, long-term sustainability isn't going to be there. And that really hasn't been part of the discussion yet, other than, you know, radical reinvention, which, you know, those 2 vignettes before, you know, I think causes us to think well, but in the more real world, especially of a, you know, ex-urban or rural church like we are, it's hard to see the applicability.
Last week, I was with a 100-year-old donor, and what struck me, we were talking about his legacy and cultivating that. But what was so stunning is we had gone out to dinner, and he said, "Ellie, can you name the 6th grade ends of the church?" And, you know, I've been out of seminary 21 years, and I would rattle them off my tongue very easily then, but I hadn't eaten lunch that day, and I was famished and not thinking clearly, and the only thing I could articulate was the proclamation of the gospel for humankind. It's actually the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, but I left out salvation, right? And this fellow whips out his wallet and pulls out a card with the 6th grade ends of the church on it. And sitting around this table, we're having dinner together, Presbytery administrative assistant, the fellow's 2 of his 4 children, and one of his grandchildren. And he reads off the 6th grade ends of the church, and he said, "Imagine if we only lived into these. Our church wouldn't be dying." And he was right. And what was stunning to me is, here's a Presbyterian elder, a man of deep faith, who continuing to engage in ministry locally and internationally, really being a partner in ministry, seeking to facilitate it and encourage others, and really seeking to live what is to be the church. But it was stunning too, because his kids had nothing to do with the church. So it goes back to a conversation Ben was having in our group of, you know, how do we talk about this in a meaningful way for people out there who don't have the context of church? We don't need to be, as Ben said, apologizing for it. And did Ben leave? He's gone, yeah. We don't if we're apologizing for church, as Lillian Daniel will talk about in her book, he mentioned her book, I am tired for apologizing for the church I don't belong to. That's what Ben referred to. And he said, so many folks don't even know the context of church. So what does it mean to engage in ministry and reach people, those both nuns and doves out there, with the gospel in meaningful ways? And so a lot of it comes back to, Jim, what you're talking about is understanding who you are and listening for what God is calling us to be and do. And I think the property issues where those come in is, we know there are 3 P's in a church budget: property, or place, people, and program. And too often when we feel we're being stretched financially and with time and talent, the first thing that goes is our program, then our people, and the last thing is our property. So the property becomes the sacred cow that often we don't want to let go of. But the key is, how do we get back to really thinking about those 6 great ends of the church and what it means to live into them, to really be the body of Christ. And I am going to cheat right now because I should be able to recite them off the top of my head, but I can't. So I'm going to cheat right now and share them with you real quick. The shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God, the maintenance of divine worship, the preservation of the truth, the promotion of social righteousness, and the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world, right? So how do we live into those things? Sometimes it's hard to find the space for the conversation when we're tired, when we're feeling overwhelmed. And I think the biggest assurance is knowing that God walks with us and doesn't leave us orphaned. And if we can claim that, how does that help us live in to the new day of ministry and what that looks like, right? Thoughts from others? Yes, Neil.
I think as sessions, as church body, church family, we need to start thinking about what we have to give, not what we have coming in. And I don't mean monetarily, I mean time and energy. Where are we needed in our community? How can we reach out to people, not to get them to come into church, but reach them where they are and what they're doing? One of the things our church has done, and will start doing again as soon as the COVID restrictions are lifted, is we do a pancake breakfast once a month, first Saturday of every month. And our congregation for the pancake breakfast is 5 times what we have in church on Sunday. And some people, that's the only church they know, is the fellowship that they have for pancake breakfast. And that's part of our mission, is to reach out to those people.
Thank you. Others? A lot of folks have been quiet. What are your thoughts from these conversations today? What is helpful? What are other things you want to be thinking about? Are there more things you'd like to hear from Paul? Reverend Kong, I see you up there. Did you want to comment?
Well, I have been away from this conversation, and it's good to participate. It's good to hear the opinions. And I did have some, opinions about the leadership of the church. I served the 2 churches and before I went overseas. One church had 6 members of the session, and one of them is, built-in leader. He was the the president of the bank and all that. And he was a good leader. He kind of, accepted me. That was my first parish experience. And the other church had 12 elders on a session, and there's no chief. They're all Indians, They were struggling each other, and there's no built-in leader. One of the ladies wrote me after 40 some years later, and she told me that she had real experience of good ministry from me, and that was really heartwarming experience. But I didn't really have any issues with the building or anything like that. And yeah, I did have trouble logging on to this thing this morning because I couldn't find meeting ID, and then they're asking a passcode and things like that, So I was not able to do that earlier. Yeah.
Well, we're glad you were able to join us, and it's being recorded, so you'll be able to see Paul's presentation later as well in the recording.
Oh, okay. That's great. Yeah. But so far, I'm glad to have participated in this discussion so that I may know what it's like.
Excellent. And Nancy, Doug, Louise, Sean, Sam, Lori Anson, Connie, who else haven't we heard from? Lori Shipman, Jacqueline. Any of you have thoughts or things you're wondering or reactions to this?
Yeah, well, I don't think you can actually talk about reinventing the church without talking about reinventing the way we have conceived of the church and its leadership for the last few hundred years. Because I think we've depended on a professional class of clergy, and I think that model of the church is going away. And we're going to have to think about how groups of Christians can be the church and identify people with gifts for leadership and offer them leadership formation and theological education. And they're not going to have to depend on salaries and pension funds and medical plans, because the whole shape of the administrative structure of the church is going to be different. And I think this kind of discussion is just oriented toward trying to prop up an institution that's really whose time has ended.
Okay. Yes, Doug.
I think that I guess you could say the landscape of the culture is putting the church in a transition, and we don't know where it's going. It used to be that the church was a central part of each community, and then it's gone to the schools. It used to be that we had a lot of patterns for during the week with different worship services, and sports were confined to schools. Now sports are all community related, and they impinge on what people considered their Sunday time. We used to have blue laws. We used to have, we had a lot I used to have. But as Sam was saying, the whole dynamic of the structure of a church is in transition. And we're just trying to resist the transition, but not being able to come up with a vision that doesn't change year to year. We were thinking one thing, and then last year happened with the pandemic, and think of all the businesses that had to transition to now. How many of them are not having their employees come back to work because they can work at home? Think of all the parents who had to make a decision as to which parent stays home with the kids to try to instruct them and pretend they were classroom teachers and try to get internet access to work in the classroom and lost that income. So, I mean, we were forced into a transition, and even though we want leadership, we want to cultivate young leaders so that those of us in the older years don't think that we have to do everything. But then if you look at the church congregations, as was being made reference earlier, the grandsons or the grandchildren of the person you were eating lunch with were, I presume, not participating in many church activities. And so that's the landscape that's changing. And how do we get local leadership? I had a couple on my session that were the local leaders. And now I know within 6 months, one of them is retiring to Mississippi. And within 3 or 4 years, another one is retiring and moving into the Albany area. And there's nobody else really less than 50 in the congregation that is a leadership model that wants to assume some additional leadership. So it's a transition, and we may have to just see where that goes. But we recognize it's not permanent, that we are in transition.
Well, and the big question is, what does it mean to be a community of faith? What does it mean to share the gospel? And, 55 years ago, when my dad was in seminary, Dr. Bill Orr, the mentor of Mr. Rogers and lots of other Presbyterian ministers through the ages, would talk about how his father's generation and plenty of preachers before that would always say the church is a generation from death. And we're experiencing that so much more acutely now than 50 some years ago. And so what does it mean to share the gospel? And what does it mean to share our resources of time, talent, and finances to ensure that the gospel continues to be shared for those generations we have yet to imagine as well? What does it mean? Do we have a vision of how to carry the gospel to future generations, just like the monks carried it through the Dark Ages, right? And so it's putting on different lenses to think about that, but also saying, I'm not walking away, or yes, COVID is hard. Ministers are putting in so much more time just in trying to do hybrid worship. And it takes a lot of energy. And we found that people aren't always as compassionate in these COVID days. Sometimes some people have behaved in ways we had never imagined in the lives of our congregation, fighting back and being more hostile rather than really coming together. And so, there's fear for many pastors I know, what does ministry look like going forward, particularly when people have gotten out of the practice of gathering together as the community of faith and worship and in spiritual formation and engaging in mission. So, the key is, how do we claim God's presence and encourage folks to be the body of Christ together? Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of unknown questions out there, but we here at the foundation are here to walk with you as you seek to navigate, sharing best practices and sharing new things we're learning. Paul, other commentary?
Yeah, there's no question that COVID-19 presents an unknown. I'm not sure that I buy that it's an unprecedented change in American culture. And You know, I think sometimes we're all guilty of getting a little bit dramatic about nothing's ever going to be normal again. I had the benefit of being the child of a Presbyterian preacher's kid who lived to be 97. And he grew up in the Depression. He went off to World War II. And those two episodes alone could easily be blamed for lots of changes in American society. But I think it's important that we take a look at churches around us, communities around us. There are churches that are growing. There are churches that are vibrant. Now, if you look at the data is pretty sobering. Even before COVID, the churches that were growing tended to be large churches. Small churches were statistically unlikely to grow. Large churches were much more likely to grow. And it's hard for a small church to become a large church. It's probably a lot easier for a small church or for a large church to mess some things up and run a lot of people off. But let's think about something. With the advent of COVID-19 and the move to so much digital engagement, our friends in the non-denominational space were pretty unabashed about seeing that as an opportunity to pick up new members. And friends, some of those new members used to be our members. I'm in a congregation in Greenville, South Carolina. We know we lost some folks because some of the non-denoms stayed open longer than we did or reopened earlier than we did. I think it's important that we look at who's performing well, who are the best practices within Cayuga-Syracuse Presbytery, within that section of the world in which we find ourselves. There are churches that are growing and are flourishing. And I would encourage you to think about this. Sometimes we sort of turn sideways and say, oh, well, you know, we're different. Did you know that the largest Presbyterian church in the United States is in New York? New York does not have the highest density of religious observance. I'm trying to think of who it is. I think it might be Texas. But the biggest Presbyterian church in the USA is in New York. And it's not one of ours. So what does it mean to build or to rebuild a robust community? What does it mean to become perhaps not the center of the village, but the center of the congregation? When my wife's roommate from graduate school got married, it was at one of those great big Texas megachurches. And what I discovered was their campus was occupied 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, not to say that that is perfect. I do not want to be in a church where 100% of my friends are other Presbyterians at Westminster Presbyterian Church of Greenville. I don't think that's healthy. But we can look at what some others are doing. And whether it's Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, whether it's some of the other non-denominationals or the denominationals. If you haven't done it, I would encourage you in your own community to ask around and find out what's the hot church that the young people are going to. I can tell you what it is in Greenville. My daughter goes there, drives me crazy, but they figured out how to attract 20-year-old college students. And she drives 1 hour each way, as opposed to literally walking to the Presbyterian church across the street from her campus. So I would encourage you to check out the competition, see what they're doing. You're not going to like some of the things they're doing, but take a look not just at what they're doing, but how they're doing it. How do they engage? How do they welcome first-time visitors? There are churches that are growing, even in this weird environment in which we find ourselves. And I think one of the challenges for us is to take a look and see what we can learn. And it'll probably take us outside our comfort zone a little bit. And there are going to be plenty of things that we'd say we cannot or we will not do. But looking at those that are flourishing, even as we struggle, would probably be a pretty good exercise for many of us, maybe even for all of us. Ellie?
So I'm going to butt in and say that we are past our time. And we could always go past our time with these kinds of conversations. So Ellie, I'm happy to give you last word, but I do want to make sure there's time to thank both you and Paul for your presence here and for what you have shared. And Ellie, especially, this is your third time with us. So thank you. That's 3 thank yous. We will miss you as you go and work with our siblings a little bit to the south. And we do look forward to greeting Rose and inviting her into our midst as well. But many, many thanks for sharing your wisdom. Okay. Are we set to go? Heads nodding, knowing that the conversation isn't over. Next month, we're going to tackle that 5th attribute that Paul raised, which is vision. And Susan Etherton from the Arlington Church is going to share the process of how their congregation discovered that vision for what to do next. And that really drove everything else. But invite you to be here for that. And again, many thanks to the foundation for your ministry amongst us. It's appreciated. All right. Blessings, y'all.
So long, folks.
Take
Thanks
care.
for your time.
Shalom.
Thank you.